Hi everyone. This isn't easy for me to share, but I've carried this story for nearly 2 decades, and I need to get it off my chest. I've spent years wondering what could have been, questioning my choices, and grappling with emotions I thought I'd buried. Maybe someone out there will read this and feel a little less alone. 18 years ago, I disappeared. Not in the way people vanish in crime shows, but in a way that felt just as absolute. My name's Everett, and back then, I thought I had it all. I was 36, married to the woman I'd adored since college, Corinne, and we had a son, Jonah, who had just turned 6. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Corinne was everything to me, or so I believed. She had this way of lighting up a room, a laugh that could soften even the hardest day. I worked long hours as a structural engineer, and I loved knowing that the home I was building wasn't just for me. It was for us. Jonah was our world, and every decision I made was to secure a better future for him. But as I sit here now, writing this, I realize how blind I was. It started with the little things. Corinne became distracted. She'd always been attentive, the kind of person who remembered to pack my favorite snacks for work trips or send me sweet texts in the middle of the day. But that changed. She was suddenly glued to her phone, always smiling at messages I wasn't privy to. When I asked, she'd brush it off, saying it was work or just friends. I wanted to believe her. I pushed down the uneasy feeling in my gut, the one that whispered something wasn't right. I convinced myself I was overthinking, that I was letting stress cloud my judgment. She'd been busy with her photography gigs, taking on more work than usual. I chalked it up to her career finally picking up steam. But the signs were there, and I ignored them. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the new outfits she said were just for work. Looking back, it was all so obvious, but at the time, I couldn't fathom that the woman I loved, the mother of my child, could betray me. Then came the night everything unraveled. It was a Thursday in early November. Jonah had fallen asleep in his room, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Corinne announced she was heading out. She said she had to meet a client to discuss a last-minute photo shoot. Her tone was casual, almost too casual. I asked her if she'd be late, and she gave me that same dismissive smile, the one she'd been perfecting for months. As she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, I felt this overwhelming urge to stop her. I don't know what I planned to say, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I nodded and let her go, telling myself I was being paranoid. But paranoia has a funny way of gnawing at you, doesn't it? That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every odd moment from the past few months. My mind ran wild with questions I was too afraid to ask. Where was she really going? Who was she meeting? Why did I feel like the ground beneath me was shifting? I stayed up until nearly midnight, pacing the house. That's when I noticed something. Corinne's laptop was sitting on the coffee table, still open. She never left it out like that. Normally, she was meticulous about her things. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of guy to snoop. Trust was the foundation of our marriage, or so I thought. But that night, something in me snapped. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was intuition. Whatever it was, I found myself sitting down and opening her emails. And that's when my world came crashing down. There it was, in black and white. Emails between Corinne and someone named Dale. I didn't recognize the name, but the context was impossible to misinterpret. Their words were seared into my brain. Plans to meet up, jokes about keeping their secret, and the kind of intimate details that made my stomach churn. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I scrolled through months of messages, each one more damning than the last. Dale wasn't just anyone. He was someone she worked with, someone she'd been seeing while I was at work, while I was tucking Jonah into bed, while I was sacrificing my sanity to give her the life she wanted. The betrayal hit me like a freight train. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to breathe. My hands shook as I closed the laptop, my mind racing with questions. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't I seen it sooner? But most of all, what was I going to do? I didn't confront her that night. I didn't sleep either. I sat in the dark, replaying every moment of our marriage, trying to pinpoint where it had all gone wrong. By the time the sun rose, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't stay. Not in this house. Not in this marriage. I'll stop here for now, but this is just the beginning. What came next changed everything. For me, for Jonah, and for Corinne. And 18 years later, the truth my son revealed shattered what little closure I thought I'd found. The morning after discovering Corinne's betrayal, I sat in the kitchen staring at the wall, replaying everything I'd read in those emails. My mind was in chaos, my heart shattered into a million pieces. The thought of confronting her terrified me, not because I was afraid of her reaction, but because I knew deep down that her lies wouldn't stop. Even if she admitted to the affair, she would twist the narrative, turn it around on me, and try to salvage her pride. I couldn't stomach the thought of hearing her excuses, her half-hearted apologies. I knew her too well. Corinne was the type of person who never admitted she was wrong unless it served her. That was the moment I realized I needed to leave. I didn't make the decision lightly. Jonah was the first thing that came to mind. I'd been a present father, even when work drained every ounce of energy from me. I made it a point to be there for his school plays, his soccer games, and those bedtime stories he loved so much. Walking away from him felt like abandoning the very thing I cherished most in this world. But what was the alternative? To stay in a home built on lies? To let him grow up thinking this was normal, that love meant betrayal and deceit? No, I couldn't let that happen. I paced the living room for hours that morning, running through every scenario. Maybe I could just kick her out, demand full custody of Jonah, and start over. But then what? Corinne was a master manipulator. She'd play the victim card, drag me through court, and turn Jonah against me. She'd paint herself as the heartbroken wife, the mother doing her best in the face of an unreasonable, absent father. I'd seen people like her do it before, and I couldn't bear the thought of Jonah getting caught in the crossfire. By the time the sun began to rise, my decision was clear. I had to disappear, not just for my sake, but for Jonah's. I believed that stepping out of his life, as painful as it was, would spare him the confusion and toxicity of living with two parents who couldn't stand each other. I packed a bag with trembling hands. I wasn't even sure what it'd take. A few clothes, my passport, and a wad of cash I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet, just in case. I grabbed a framed photo of Jonah and me from our camping trip last summer. It was the happiest I'd felt in years, the two of us laughing as we roasted marshmallows by the fire. I tucked it into the bag, knowing I'd need it to keep me grounded in the months ahead. Before I left, I stepped into Jonah's room one last time. The soft glow of his nightlight illuminated his small figure, curled up with his favorite stuffed dinosaur. My heart broke all over again. How could I leave him? What kind of father does that? I leaned against the doorway, fighting the urge to wake him up and explain everything. But what could I say to a 6-year-old that would make this any easier? I whispered, "I love you, buddy," before closing the door and walking away. Corinne came home just as I was pulling out of the driveway. She looked surprised to see me up so early but didn't ask any questions. I didn't give her the chance. I rolled down the window and said, "You'll get what you deserve, Corinne. I hope you're happy with Dale." Her face went pale, and for the first time in months, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Before she could respond, I drove off, leaving her standing there in her robe, clutching her coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I didn't have a plan when I left. I just drove. The highways blurred together as I put as much distance as I could between myself and the life I was leaving behind. I turned off my phone to avoid the constant calls and texts that I knew were coming. I didn't want to hear her voice, her pleas for me to come back, or worse, her anger at being caught. After hours of driving, I stopped at a small diner in a town whose name I didn't bother to learn. I sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, and stared blankly at the menu. The waitress, a kind woman in her 50s, noticed my disheveled state and offered me a free slice of pie. I guess I looked as broken as I felt. "Rough day?" she asked. I nodded but didn't elaborate. What could I say? That my wife of 10 years had been cheating on me? That I just left my son behind? I couldn't even process it myself, let alone explain it to a stranger. That night, I checked into a rundown motel on the edge of town. The room smelled like mildew, and the bed was lumpy, but I didn't care. I sat on the floor, staring at the photo of Jonah and me, and cried for what felt like hours. I wasn't just mourning my marriage. I was mourning the life I thought I had, the future I'd planned, and the family I'd worked so hard to protect. It all felt like a cruel joke, like the universe had pulled the rug out from under me and left me with nothing. For the first few weeks, I lived in a haze. I moved from town to town, paying for everything in cash to avoid leaving a trail. I slept in motels, ate cheap diner food, and tried to figure out who I was without Corinne and Jonah. The guilt of leaving my son gnawed at me constantly, but I told myself it was for the best. He deserved a stable life, even if it meant I couldn't be part of it. I changed my name, adopting the identity of Matthew, a man with no past and no attachments. I found work doing odd jobs under the table, construction, landscaping, whatever I could find. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy and gave me something to focus on besides my own misery. Every night, I thought about Jonah. I wondered how he was doing, whether he missed me, whether he was angry at me for leaving. I imagined Corinne spinning her web of lies, telling him I'd abandoned them because I didn't care. The thought made my blood boil, but there was nothing I could do. I was a ghost now, a man without a family, without a home. And yet, in the quiet moments, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made a mistake. Maybe I should have fought for Jonah, taken Corinne to court, and exposed her for who she really was. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't have worked. Corinne was too cunning, too good at playing the victim. She would have turned Jonah against me, and I couldn't bear the thought of losing him that way. So I stayed gone. I buried Everett and became Matthew, a man trying to start over in a world that felt foreign and unforgiving. I thought I'd made peace with my decision, but 18 years later, when Jonah found me and revealed the truth, everything I thought I knew came crashing down. In the year that followed my disappearance, I lived as if I were walking through a waking nightmare. I had no plan, no roadmap for how to rebuild my life. All I knew was that I couldn't go back. Not to Corinne, not to the house where every corner would remind me of her betrayal, and certainly not to Jonah, who deserved better than the broken version of me I had become. I ended up in a small, unremarkable town several states away. The kind of place where everyone minds their own business, where people accept a man with no past as long as he works hard and doesn't cause trouble. I rented a modest studio apartment with peeling wallpaper and a leaky faucet, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt a strange sense of peace in the simplicity. I took odd jobs, construction, handyman work, whatever paid in cash and kept me busy. The physical labor was exhausting, but I welcomed the distraction. With every brick I laid, every nail I hammered, I felt a tiny piece of the anger and heartbreak chip away. The days were grueling, but the nights were the hardest. That was when the quiet crept in, and with it, the memories. Jonah's laughter, the way he used to cling to my leg when I came home from work, his endless questions about the world. Those thoughts haunted me. I couldn't help but imagine him asking Corinne where I had gone, and the lies she must have told him to cover her tracks. The guilt was suffocating, but I convinced myself it was better this way. Better for him to think I was a bad father than to grow up in a house full of resentment and betrayal. Months turned into years, and slowly, I began to carve out a life for myself. I changed my name to Matthew Coleman and created a new identity. Everett became a ghost, a man who had died the day he left his family behind. I told anyone who asked that I was a widower, and they didn't pry further. It was easier than explaining the truth, and in some ways, it felt like less of a lie. I kept Jonah's photo in my wallet, the one from our last camping trip together. It became my anchor, the one thing that reminded me of who I used to be. On the darkest nights, I'd pull it out and stare at his smiling face, whispering apologies he'd never hear. But no matter how much time passed, the wounds never fully healed. I avoided the internet, resisted the urge to look up Corinne or Jonah, and stayed away from any place that might connect me to my old life. Still, there were moments when the past crept in uninvited, like when I'd see a father playing with his son at the park or hear a boy's voice that sounded eerily like Jonah's. Those moments hit me like a freight train, reminding me of everything I'd lost, everything I'd given up. 7 years after I vanished, I had my first real test. I was walking home from work one evening when I passed a park. There was a boy, maybe 12 or 13, tossing a baseball with his dad. The boy's sandy blonde hair caught the sunlight just right, and for a moment, I froze. He looked so much like Jonah at that age that my heart skipped a beat. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching them laugh and play. The father caught the ball and ruffled the boy's hair, and I felt a pang of longing so sharp it nearly brought me to my knees. It was as if I were watching an alternate version of my life, one where I hadn't left, where I was the one playing catch with Jonah in the fading light of a summer evening. That night, I broke a promise I had made to myself. I went home, sat down at the small desk in my apartment, and opened my laptop. For the first time since I disappeared, I allowed myself to search for Jonah. My hands trembled as I typed his name into the search bar, half expecting to find nothing. But I did find something, a school photo from his middle school's website. He looked older, taller, but it was him. My Jonah. The smile was the same, but there was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, memorizing every detail of his face. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the background of the photo, standing next to Jonah, was a man I didn't recognize. He had an arm around Jonah's shoulder, and the caption identified him as Coach Dale. Dale. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I slammed the laptop shut and sat there in the dark, my mind racing. Was this the same Dale? The one who had destroyed my marriage? Was he in Jonah's life now, playing the role of father? The thought made my stomach turn. But what could I do? I had no right to interfere, no claim to Jonah after all these years. I tried to tell myself that it didn't matter, that Jonah was probably better off with Dale than with a ghost like me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I had abandoned my son, and now the man who had ruined my life was stepping into the role I should have been playing. That night, for the first time in years, I cried myself to sleep. After seeing Jonah's photo with Dale, I couldn't focus on anything else. Every waking moment, my mind replayed that image, Dale's arm draped around Jonah's shoulder like he belonged there. The thought of him raising my son, playing the father figure I had forfeited, was unbearable. It wasn't just anger I felt, it was shame, regret, and a deep, unshakable sadness. I tried to bury myself in work, but it was no use. Every hammer strike, every measured plank of wood, felt meaningless. My coworkers noticed my distraction, but I waved off their questions. How could I explain the storm raging inside me? Late at night, I found myself staring at Jonah's school photo on my laptop. I shouldn't have saved it, but I couldn't help myself. I zoomed in, studying every detail of his face. He looked happy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed him. Was he thinking about me? Did he wonder why I left? Or had Corinne and Dale filled the void, erasing me from his life completely? For the first time since I left, I considered going back. Not to Corinne, never to her, but to Jonah. I wanted to tell him the truth, to explain why I had disappeared. But the fear of what I might find held me back. What if he hated me? What if he had no memory of me at all? Weeks turned into months, and the weight of my decision pressed down harder with each passing day. One evening, I returned to the park where I had first seen the boy who reminded me of Jonah. I sat on a bench, watching fathers and sons playing catch, riding bikes and laughing together. I felt like an intruder, an outsider looking in on a world that no longer belonged to me. An older man sat down next to me, interrupting my thoughts. He introduced himself as George and mentioned that he came to the park every evening to feed the ducks. I must have looked lost, because he asked if I was okay. I hesitated but found myself opening up more than I intended. I told him I had made mistakes, big ones, and that I didn't know how to fix them. George nodded thoughtfully. You know, he said, sometimes it's not about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about showing up, even if it's late. His words stayed with me long after he left. Showing up. It sounded so simple, but it felt impossible. Could I really face Jonah after all these years? Did I even deserve the chance? One night, after hours of staring at Jonah's photo, I made a decision. I couldn't keep running from my past. If I ever wanted peace, I had to confront it, no matter how painful it might be. I didn't have a plan, but I knew I had to start somewhere. That was the night everything changed. Making the decision to face my past was one thing. Acting on it was another. For days, I wavered, paralyzed by fear and self-doubt. I imagined every possible scenario, Jonah slamming the door in my face, Corinne laughing at me, Dale taunting me for being too weak to stay. The what-ifs were suffocating, but the alternative, living in limbo forever, was worse. I spent a sleepless night writing a letter to Jonah. It was a clumsy, rambling mess, but it was the best I could manage. I told him I was sorry for leaving, that I had made mistakes I couldn't undo. I didn't mention Corinne or Dale. I didn't want to poison his view of them, but I made it clear that my leaving had nothing to do with him. "You were the best part of my life," I wrote. "I just didn't know how to stay." I folded the letter and tucked it into an envelope, but I didn't have the courage to mail it. Instead, I tucked it into my bag and booked a bus ticket back to the city I had fled from nearly a decade earlier. The bus ride felt like a journey through time. Every mile brought back memories I had tried to bury: birthday parties, family dinners, lazy Sundays in the backyard. But there were darker memories, too. The nights Corinne came home late with flimsy excuses, the gut-wrenching realization of her betrayal, and the image of Dale's name in those emails. When I finally arrived in the city, it was as if no time had passed. The streets were the same. The coffee shop where Corinne and I used to go on dates still stood on the corner, and the park where Jonah had played as a toddler was filled with families. It felt surreal, like stepping into a life that no longer belonged to me. I found myself standing outside Jonah's old school. It had been years since I'd seen it, but it looked exactly as I remembered. I stared at the playground, picturing him running around with his friends, and my chest tightened with regret. I had missed so much: birthdays, holidays, school events. I had missed watching him grow up. I didn't know what I was expecting to find there, but I stayed until the sun began to set. That's when I noticed a familiar figure walking across the parking lot. It was Corinne. She hadn't changed much. Her hair was shorter, streaked with a few strands of gray, but she still carried herself with the same confidence. She was talking to a man, Dale. The sight of him made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay calm. They seemed to be arguing, their voices low but intense. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clear that whatever bond they once had was strained. I watched as they got into separate cars and drove off, leaving the parking lot empty. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what I had just seen. Part of me felt vindicated. Maybe their relationship wasn't as perfect as they had tried to make it seem. But another part of me felt hollow. Seeing them together, even in conflict, reminded me of everything I had lost. I walked back to my motel that night with a mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a sliver of hope. If their relationship was crumbling, maybe it was a sign. Maybe I could still rebuild something with Jonah, even if it was just a fragile connection. The next morning, I took a deep breath and made a decision. It was time to find my son. The morning after I saw Corinne and Dale, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was time to stop running and confront what I had left behind. My hands trembled as I stared at the letter I'd written to Jonah, still tucked inside my bag. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my jacket pocket, and left the motel. Finding Jonah wasn't as difficult as I'd expected. His school photo had been my first clue, and from there, it didn't take much to track him down. A quick internet search of his school led me to his high school graduation announcement, which included his full name and the college he had attended. Seeing the milestones I had missed, his high school years, his transition into adulthood, was like a dagger to my chest. But it also gave me the motivation I needed to keep going. After several hours of searching, I found his current address. It was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, not far from where I had last seen Corinne and Dale. I stood outside his house for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest. The thought of seeing him again after all these years terrified me. What if he didn't want to see me? What if he hated me for leaving? I debated leaving the letter in his mailbox and walking away, but something in me refused to take the easy way out. Jonah deserved more than that. He deserved to hear from me in person, to look me in the eye, and ask the questions I knew he had every right to ask. I rang the doorbell, my palms sweating as I waited. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Finally, the door opened, and there he was, Jonah. He looked so much like the boy I had left behind, yet so different. His sandy blonde hair was shorter, his face more angular, but his eyes were unmistakably his mother's. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Jonah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's me, your dad." His eyes widened, and I could see the wheels turning in his head as he processed what I just said. For a moment, I thought he might slam the door in my face, but instead, he stepped back and motioned for me to come inside. I followed him into the house, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. We sat across from each other in his living room, the silence between us thick and uncomfortable. Jonah looked at me like I was a ghost, someone he thought he'd never see again. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why now?" he asked, his voice laced with both anger and pain. "Why after all these years?" I took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I know I can't undo what I did," I began. "I left because I thought it was the only way to protect you. I was wrong. I should have stayed and fought for you, but I was scared, and I didn't know how to handle everything." He didn't say anything, but I could see the emotions swirling in his eyes, anger, sadness, and something that looked like longing. I handed him the letter, my hands shaking as I did. "This explains everything," I said. "It's not an excuse, but it's the truth." Jonah took the letter, but didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "Do you know what it was like growing up without you?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Mom told me you left because you didn't care about us, that you were a coward who couldn't handle being a dad." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. "That's not true," I said, my voice firm. "I left because I didn't want you to grow up in a house full of lies. Your mom, she betrayed me in ways I couldn't handle. But I never stopped loving you, Jonah. Not for a single day." We talked for hours, the conversation swinging between anger, sadness, and cautious understanding. Jonah told me about his childhood, how he had struggled to make sense of my absence. He admitted that he had resented me for years, but as he got older, he started questioning the story his mother had told him. "I always felt like there was more to it," he said quietly. "Mom and Dale, they weren't exactly subtle. He moved in not long after you left, and I started noticing things." I tensed at the mention of Dale, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What things?" I asked. Jonah hesitated, then looked me in the eye. "I know he wasn't just some guy she started seeing after you left. He was already around before you were gone, wasn't he?" The weight of his question hung in the air, and I knew I couldn't lie to him. "Yes," I admitted. "I found out about them, and it broke me. That's why I left. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I see now that I was wrong." Jonah nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I always suspected," he said, "but hearing it from you, it makes things clearer." By the time I left his house that night, we were still far from repairing our relationship, but there was a glimmer of hope. Jonah didn't slam the door in my face, and he didn't tell me to leave and never come back. For now, that was enough. But the biggest revelation came just as I was walking out the door. "Wait," Jonah said, stopping me in my tracks. "There's something you need to know about Dale." I turned to face him, my stomach twisting into knots. "What is it?" Jonah hesitated, then said, "He's not who you think he is. And neither is Mom." Those words hung in the air, heavy with implications I couldn't begin to process. As I walked away, I knew that whatever Jonah was about to reveal would change everything. I barely slept that night. Jonah's words replayed in my mind over and over again. "He's not who you think he is. And neither is Mom." What did that mean? After everything I had already uncovered about Corinne and Dale, what more could there be? I had already lived through the worst of it, or so I thought. But the way Jonah had looked at me, his hesitation, his tone, it told me there was something deeper, something I had never even considered. By morning, I knew I couldn't wait. I had to hear what Jonah had to say, no matter how painful it was. I knocked on his door just after noon. He opened it quickly, as if he had been expecting me. His expression was unreadable, but there was tension in his shoulders. Without a word, he stepped aside to let me in. We sat in the same living room as the night before, but this time, the air was heavier. Jonah was quiet for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I don't know where to start," he admitted. "I guess I should just tell you what I know." I nodded, bracing myself. Go ahead. Jonah ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling to put his thoughts into words. You were right about Mom and Dale. They were seeing each other before you left. But it wasn't just an affair. It was more than that. I frowned. More than that? What are you saying? Jonah's jaw tightened. I didn't find this out until years later, but Dale wasn't just some guy she met at work. He was part of something bigger. Something planned. My stomach churned. Planned? Jonah, you're not making sense. Jonah exhaled sharply, then met my eyes. Mom and Dale had been seeing each other for a long time before you found out. But Mom, she didn't just cheat on you. She set you up. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. What do you mean she set me up? She wanted you gone, Dad. That's why she never fought for you to stay. She didn't even try to fix things because she didn't want to. She needed you out of the picture so she and Dale could take over everything. Your money, the house, everything you built. And when you left on your own, it saved her from having to force you out. My breath caught in my throat. I had spent years believing I had made the decision to disappear, that I had walked away because I had no other choice. But now, Jonah was telling me that was exactly what Corinne had wanted all along. She manipulated you, Jonah continued. She didn't beg you to stay because she wanted you gone. And Dale? He was more than just her affair partner. He was in on it. I gripped the armrest of the chair, my knuckles turning white. Jonah, how do you know all this? Jonah's face darkened. Because I overheard them talking about it years ago. When I was 15, I heard Dale say something to Mom that I'll never forget. He said, "It worked out perfectly, didn't it?" He walked away before we even had to push him. I felt like the room was spinning. My entire life had been a lie. The decision I thought I had made for myself hadn't been mine at all. I had been manipulated, pushed toward the edge until I made the only choice they wanted me to make. The betrayal cut even deeper now. I had always thought Corinne was just a selfish woman who had cheated out of boredom, but this was calculated. She hadn't just broken our vows. She had destroyed my life with full intent. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jonah looked down. Because I didn't know how. And because for a long time, I wasn't sure what to believe. Mom was so good at lying, and I was just a kid. But now that you're back, I need you to know the truth. I stared at my son, a young man who had spent years trapped in the mess Corinne and Dale had created. My heart ached for him, for all the years he had spent living under their roof, believing their lies. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't walk away again. I had spent nearly 2 decades running from my past, but now I had a reason to stay. This wasn't just about facing my mistakes anymore. It was about uncovering the full truth and making sure Corinne and Dale paid for what they had done. For years, I had believed that leaving was my decision, that I had walked away from my old life because I was too broken to stay. But now I saw the truth. Corinne had orchestrated everything, manipulating me into disappearing so she could take everything I had built. But she hadn't taken everything. I still had Jonah, and this time, I wasn't going to run. After hearing the full truth from Jonah, something inside me shifted. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I wasn't a ghost anymore. I wasn't just a man without a past, drifting through life without purpose. I had a reason to fight. I told Jonah that I wasn't leaving again, no matter what. He didn't say much at first, just nodded, but I could see it in his eyes, the small flicker of hope, the part of him that had waited years for me to come back. It wasn't going to be easy. There was too much history, too much pain to just pretend the past didn't happen. But we had time now, time to rebuild, to learn who we were after all these years apart. That night, for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. Over the next few weeks, Jonah and I spent more time together. We talked, really talked. He told me about his childhood, the moments he had wished I had been there, the struggles he had faced growing up under Corinne's lies. It hurt to hear, but I listened to every word. I wanted to understand everything I had missed, even the painful parts. I got a job in the city doing construction work again. Steady, honest work that kept me grounded. Jonah came by on weekends, and we made it a tradition to have breakfast at a small diner nearby. Slowly, we were piecing together something real, something unshakable. And then, one day, Jonah gave me news that made everything worth it. I'm getting married, he told me with a nervous smile. And I want you there, if you're up for it. I felt my throat tighten. You mean that? Yeah, he said. It's time, Dad. I want you to be part of my life again. I had spent years believing I had lost my son forever, that my choices had ruined any chance of having a relationship with him. But here he was, offering me something I never thought I'd get, a second chance. The day of Jonah's wedding was the first time I had seen Corinne in nearly 20 years. She was sitting near the back, alone. Dale was nowhere in sight. Jonah had told me that their relationship had fallen apart years ago. Turns out, betrayal doesn't build a lasting foundation. She looked at me as I passed, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Guilt? I didn't know and I didn't care. She was part of my past, a ghost of a life I had left behind. As Jonah stood at the altar, looking at the woman he was about to marry, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. I had made mistakes, yes, but I had also found my way back to the one thing that mattered most. Jonah had given me a chance to be his father again, and I wasn't going to waste it. As I watched my son start his new life, I finally understood something. I hadn't vanished. I had just been waiting to be found, and now I was home.